Now we are joined by Reyan Ali. He is a writer from Columbus, Ohio. His work includes published articles on the Wired magazine, Spin, The Atlantic, the AV Club, and he's the writer of the book NBA Jam, chronicling the history of that video game. So a lot of youngsters out there, if you don't know what NBA Jam is, you better go to either Xbox Arcade or PlayStation, or just go on YouTube and just do your research and check it out, because this is probably one of the games that have influenced not only just sports video games, but also just video game culture in general. Thanks for joining us. Really appreciate it.
Oh my gosh. Thank you guys so much for having me. I'm excited to talk.
So we wanted to pick your brain, Rayon, just by reading the book, and thank you very much for giving us in advance just a copy of it. Really appreciate it. And just noticing the book, it's short and it's kind of really easy to read. So was that really hard to kind of confine all that information, all that research, into just kind of a short, easy to read, just a book for anybody to check out?
Definitely. That was one of the hardest things throughout the whole process. So when I started working on it in 2015, so it finally came out in 2019, but I started working on it in 2015. So over those 4 years, I went from having like 5 interviews to 10 to 15 to 20. And by the end, I had 68 interviews that I all had to pare down into what you read as the book now. So that was a huge concern for me. Yeah. I mean, when you think of NBA Jam, there's so many different elements over there. You've got the video game side, the NBA culture side, you've got the midway side. I mean, you've got the whole Acclaim, the home ports versus the arcade game. So there was a lot of material over there. So I'm actually very proud to say it is the single longest book in Boss Fight Book series, the series that it's in. So I was really happy that they're able to give me so much room. So even then, yeah, it was a lot of work to trim it down.
And why do you think NBA Jam has resonated with fans even now in 2020? Because I think, in my opinion, really it's NBA Jam and NBA 2K that really been in the minds of basketball fans. Those are really the only two games fans of basketball and video games really talk about. NBA Live might be mentioned here or there, but it's NBA Jam and NBA 2K that gets mentioned. Why do you think that is?
Oh, man, there's a lot that goes into that. I think the big thing with NBA Jam is that it was very right place, right time. I mean, it's such a great game, but even taking aside the great game aspect, I mean, think about the time period that NBA Jam came out in. So it came out in 1993 in Chicago, or actually late 1992 in Chicago is when it debuted. And this is like a few months after the Dream Team, won their gold medals. This is when the Chicago Bulls were the biggest thing in the league. This is when arcade games were at a really sweet spot. And this is from the same company that put out Mortal Kombat. So they had all of these different factors going for them when they released it at the time. But, I mean, NBA Jam itself is such a playable game, and it really holds up. I mean, that 2-on-2 style is just so addictive. I mean, there's so many things that go into why it's so memorable. But, I think, it ultimately comes down to the fact that it was the right game at the right time for all those people. I mean, it was so huge. The stat that I always look at that really makes me think about how big NBA Jam actually was I think I talk about this in the book. It's that Jurassic Park in 1993 made something like $374 million. And that was the biggest thing ever. Jurassic Park 3 was everywhere in 93. And NBA Jam made triple that in tokens / quarters, which is incredible. It made $1 billion, $1 billion. And it's just such a bizarre image. The idea of people lining up in arcades to play a game. I mean, it's such a different time. But it's such a great game. It's such a great time period that, there's just so much that goes for it. The lore itself is really kind of manifested more over the years, which just speaks to how good NBA Jam is.
Absolutely. One of the things I was really interested in reading in your book was kind of also that the history of arcade gaming, because I feel like I was born in '86, and that's kind of a culture that I caught maybe the very tail end of. I mean, really, like right around that time NBA Jam came out. I think maybe like 5 years after it came out, I got to experience on an actual like arcade box, maybe the tournament edition or something like that. Was it difficult for you to find that information and that background on arcade gaming?
It actually wasn't too difficult once I knew where to look. So the big thing was trying to figure out, okay, where am I going to go digging? So I went through a lot of old magazines, lots of old websites, did lots of researching in terms of doing interviews, trying to read books about arcade games. So it was tough in the way that it was a lot to go through to be like, how am I going to explain arcade games or the culture of arcade games to somebody who is reading this book who might not read anything else about them? It was a pretty tough task, but I mean, the amazing thing is that there's information out there. Like the fact that the internet exists means that I have access to all these amazing magazines without actually having to buy them individually. So that was one of those things. Like, I'm a big arcade fan, but even I didn't know as much as I learned throughout the book.
So, I mean, you mentioned the great timing in '92. I mean, I couldn't agree with you more. That's one of I mean, arguably the most iconic year in basketball history. If you think of just on like a worldwide basis, how much do you think the game? I mean, you have great portions in the book where you talk about Shaq getting into the game and selling that to his teammates and like the NBA Jam parties they would have. You have great portions about Glenn Rice, things like that. Do you have any perception as far as how big it was in growing NBA basketball? I mean, of course, you already had like the Dream Team was out in '92 as well. How much do you think NBA contributed to that kind of positive momentum that the NBA built?
I actually think it had a pretty significant impact in some small ways. Like, as in, it's significant in the way that you might not see it immediately, but it kind of comes to fruition over time. So what I mean by that is, so I'm the spitting image of this. So I was born in Texas, but I grew up in Pakistan. And while I was there in the 90s, that is where I experienced the NBA for the first time through NBA Jam. So I became this huge NBA fan all because of this crazy 2-on-2 arcade basketball game. And I'm certain the story's out there for other people like that as well, where like, you know, they saw the Supersonics, they saw the Jazz, or, you know, they liked the dunks, they liked the On Fire. Something about it really caught their eye, and they said, okay, let me investigate this. Who actually are these NBA teams? Who are these players? But no, I think it definitely did have an impact on that. And you kind of learn about it more as you talk to people who are casual fans. You know, there are people out there who liked playing NBA Jam who don't even like basketball. And that is just such a crazy thing to think about it. You don't really find that often, like, oh, I'm a huge Madden fan, but I'll never actually watch football. Like, I can't imagine there's a lot of overlap in that, you know?
Totally. And it's, I mean, you mentioned this a lot in the book as well, but just the brilliance of you have, you know, 3 buttons that you press essentially or mess with. So I think even if you don't know the rules of basketball, if you've never seen basketball, like you said, I mean, you can jump right onto an arcade or Super Nintendo or whatever console you have. And I mean, you know, you might be down by 10 points, but by that point in time, you've learned kind of what the objective is of basketball in general. And due to maybe some of the mechanisms in the game, you're able to catch up.
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, it's so satisfying to play. I mean, that's one of the great things about NBA Jam is that it actually holds up. You know, I've gone back and I've played things that I was super psyched about when I was a kid. Like, I played Shaq Fu. Have you guys had I would say the pleasure, but have you guys had the displeasure of playing Shaq Fu?
Oh, yeah.
Oh, man. Sure. I was so disappointed. I remember I was such a huge Shaq fan, and I was like, man, this is pretty cool, Shaq martial arts. And then you played for 5 minutes, and, like, the jumps are way too large. Like, they're jumping way too high or too awkwardly. And, like, the fighting isn't very good. I'm like, man, this sucks. So what I did was I recently actually came back to it after all these years. I was like, maybe I was a stupid kid. Maybe I didn't know what was good for me. Maybe Shaq Fu's actually pretty good. And it wasn't very good at all. It's probably actually worse now that I thought about it. But NBA Jam is the opposite of that, where you can come back to it all these years later, and you can be a casual player and you can pick it up. And yeah, you play the game, you press those buttons, and almost immediately you're doing something cool. Like you're hitting these amazing 3-pointers, these amazing dunks, just out of nowhere.
Yeah, it's kind of a shame too, because everybody loves Shaq. You want Shaq Fu to be great. You want Kazam, the movie, to be great. Unfortunately, just those 2 things didn't work out anyway. Justin, you had a question?
Definitely not. Yeah.
Yeah, with Kazam, that's one of the things. Funny you bring that up, because I thought Kazam was an awesome movie when I was younger. And then
Me too.
It's terrible. I'm like, what was I thinking?
All right, what are you watching? Yeah.
Right.
Do you guys remember Steel? Yeah, do you guys remember Steel?
Yeah.
Oh, yeah. Dude, I was so psyched about Steel. It's like, Shaq is a superhero, and, you know, he has that Superman tattoo on his arm. This is perfect. This is great. And then you watch it, and you're like, wow, this is really mediocre. This is like, they could have been literally anybody over here instead of Shaq. And he's, you know, I'm not like saying like Shaq's ever going to win an Oscar, but Shaq is probably a way better actor now than he was in like 98 or 99 or whenever that movie came out.
Yeah, it's one of those that seemed like it looks so good on paper, but just nope.
Oh yeah,
That's true.
it's like wow, yeah. Um,
Also want to ask you with the kind of the newer generation now. I mean, they're so stuck on 2K. Also, I see on Twitter, it's just like okay, all these players playing 2K, and it kind of mirrors how the players were reacting to NBA Jam back in the 90s. So, do you think the generation of NBA superstars now respect NBA Jam? What's your kind of opinion of kind of the newer generation in 2020 realizing how NBA Jam actually influenced basketball culture today, or do you think they have no idea?
I think some of them do. I think there's kind of an age break someplace. I remember seeing a video that Steph Curry was in. This was probably like 2012, maybe. And somebody was doing some kind of, it was like, I think it was Bleacher Report that was doing some sort of feature with him about like, dream NBA Jam teams or something involving NBA Jam. And Steph Curry said, yeah, I have it on my phone right now. And of course, Steph Curry having that is such a great sign that shows that, it's really is everywhere. So I know that, people are familiar with it at a certain, I'm not sure what the certain age break is, but I feel like probably Steph Curry or maybe like, a few years later is the cutoff point for classic NBA Jam or anything like that. But the thing is that, whenever people still pick it up now, the thing is they still get into it. One of the things that I cut out from the book that I was really hoping to include was a story about meeting this, I think he was a 7-year-old kid. A 7-year-old kid I met at this arcade who played NBA Jam for the first time. So this is a 7-year-old. I mean, keep in mind in 2015, or no, it was 2017 when I met him, that, he wasn't there for the arcade scene. He wasn't there for 90s NBA. He wasn't there for Midway, but he still loved the game. It was because it was so good. So I think there's a little population of the NBA that's familiar with it. Kenneth Faried is another one. I talked to him for the book. He makes a cameo at the very end. I'm not sure everybody knows it, but I feel like if they knew about it, they would definitely at least give it a shot.
And you brought up arcade gaming, and I think for all of us, we have a perspective on arcade gaming and console gaming, and kind of doing a combination of both. Just we're talking off air in terms of kind of old video game systems. I had a Genesis. I kind of went that way with Sega, and also went to the arcade on occasion. But now arcades just seem to be a relic. Can you kind of put in perspective how big were arcades? Because that's where you saw not only the better graphics, the games typically came out there first. They're typically the better versions of the game. So can you kind of put in perspective of having to go to an actual place to actually play these games as opposed to just playing them on your couch?
Yeah. I mean, arcades are such a totally different experience than home gaming. Like you were saying, the idea of having to get off your couch, you actually have to physically go someplace to stand there and play a game. That's just such a foreign concept right now, but it was something that was just such a big pull back then. I mean, yeah, like you're saying, that's where you get the best games, the best graphics, the newest technology. Especially I would say around 93, 94, 95, 96, right around then, that's when arcades were at their peak technology-wise, where they're still ahead of the home consoles. But they were still innovating, and the home consoles hadn't just caught up yet. CDs hadn't come out, and the bit wars were still kind of in their final days over there. Yeah, I mean, arcade culture is something that's so special. I grew up going to lots of arcades, and I loved learning about all these arcade stories. It's kind of hard to imagine how big they were. But I've got a figure somewhere in the book of like at one point, this is like the early 90s, so relatively recent, like arcades made twice as much as console games did, which is crazy because console games were everywhere in the early 90s, but arcades were so big that they made even more money than them.
Yeah, and it's crazy to think like, you mentioned the profit that NBA Jam was available or able to make in about 10 minutes time, like $8 or so every 10 minutes, paying, 50 cents a half, I think is what you had on there. I wonder too if it's just a little bit different with everything being at home, the consumer now thinking maybe that's ridiculous to go and spend that much for one half of basketball, even when you've got these incredible home consoles now.
Yeah. But I see, you look at DLC right now. DLC is still so big. You have to pay so much for these packs. Oh, you want to get a certain player of some kind, or, you want a certain feature. I mean, I'm a big Mortal Kombat fan, and I've paid like, what was it, like $60 or $70 for the main game, and then like 40 or 60 in DLC. So, it's really interesting, that whole idea of arcades where they're just sucking away your quarters. They've taken that and they've adapted that to a new world where you can do with mobile games. You have those quick transactions with the DLC on console games. So that idea is still around. So it seems kind of archaic and old, but then when you think about it, they're pretty much still doing it, just in a totally different format.
Yeah, it's just like they've kind of reshaped it, repackaged it into something that makes sense for 2020. Totally.
Absolutely.
So, do you have a favorite squad that you usually run on NBA Jam?
Oh, it's always got to be the Jazz. For me, the Jazz, like in the original NBA Jam, that is the squad for a lot of reasons. I mean, Malone and Stockton, that to me is the iconic NBA Jam duo in my head. You've got somebody who can nail the three, somebody who's got the big dunks, and it's such a cool visual of the two of them together. But then going back to the actual historical importance of it, they were the first duo that the middleweight team saw and made them think that, hey, we actually should give these players stats. So it's I mentioned this in the first chapter. It's just so strange to think, but once upon a time, NBA Jam had players with no stats. So you'd see Karl Malone and John Stockton on the screen. They'd play the same way. They'd both dunk the same way. They both hit threes the same way. And it's just such a bizarre concept. But somebody in an arcade pointed it out. They're like, keep the ball away from Stockton. He's going to steal it. And then somebody from Midway was watching and made them think like, hey, we should probably do something about that. And then they went and they edited the stats to add that over there. So, I mean, the Utah Jazz are really where so much NBA Jam lore was born, because those stats are something that people still remember. But yeah, when it comes to the original game, it definitely got to be the Jazz. Tournament edition, I loved Sean Kemp and Gary Payton on the Supersonics. Definite favorite for me.
Nice. Justin, were you usually running the Bulls in that game?
Of course, always.
Justin's a diehard Bulls fan.
Yeah.
Oh, you got to do that. Yeah. Scottie Pippen and Horace Grant?
Yeah.
Yep. Always.
That's how I remember it. Yeah, it kind of made me a big Horace Grant fan. Just the fact that he had those goggles on in game, looked so cool all the time. Yeah, for me, it was usually running like the Warriors, actually, back then, with like all the 3-point shooting that was on those teams.
Yeah, the Run TMC era. Oh, that was so good. Yeah. That was such a fun Warriors squad. Yeah. I was at a convention a few years ago, and I found this Tim Hardaway autograph, like with the classic Golden State Warriors jersey, and I just geeked out. I was so excited. I've got it somewhere. It's sitting in a box, but man, it was just the coolest thing. I just love that Run TMC era. They were a really fun team.
Yeah, those are beautiful jerseys back then too.
Yeah.
Just that classic blue and gold. Yeah.
Agreed. Absolutely, yeah. And of course, people always associate the Warriors, at least they do now, with Steph Curry, Draymond Green, the current era. But that early 90s era was so cool too.
That's true, especially when the Warriors finally broke through and won the title and became the Warriors as we know today. Really, that fan base has been through a lot of heartbreak. I mean, just everything that they had to kind of put up with, really being underrated. It kind of came to fruition. In the 2010s. So it's just bizarre just to see people just always hype up the Warriors and wear their jerseys, because they were not even a team that was mentioned.
Oh yeah.
In prior decades. Yeah.
Definitely. I think the Kings are probably going to be like that someday. I don't know what path they'll take to get there, but in my head I see like the Kings or the T-Wolves. Somebody's going to be winning the championship, and like they're going to have some kind of up and down reign, but all those people will be bandwagoners, and other people will be like, I remember when, the Kings were Vlade Divac, or I remember Mitch Richmond. So that's one of those things that happens. But man, I love that early Golden State Warriors era. That was such a cool time.
Yeah, man, I hope you're right, because one of my first NBA games was in Arco Arena. I actually saw the Barkley Phoenix Suns play against those Kings from back then.
No way. That's awesome. Oh my gosh. Arco Arena. Wow.
So this is how young my buddy and I were that I went to that game with. Dustin, if you're listening somehow, I haven't kept in touch with him, but shout out. But this is how young we were. We were rooting for the Suns because we felt so bad that they flew all the way to California to play against the Kings. So like, oh man, they came all this way. They got to win.
That's awesome. I love that kid logic. I mean, I love the Super their logos. So yeah, there's all kinds of things that when you're a kid, you're like, that's the reason I'm going to root for that team, or that's why I root against them. So that's awesome.
And we were Californians.
Just totally betraying it for them, but
totally.
Yeah. That's
I
awesome.
also wanted to ask you. I heard a story on No Dunks, and I was wondering if you could kind of elaborate on this because it just piqued my curiosity when you told the story about Gary Payton having a limited edition of NBA Jam with himself, Gary Payton, Ken Griffey Jr., and Michael Jordan in the game, and there's only like a select few of these around the world. And I'm just wondering, have you heard of like any kind of diehard video game collectors? I know these days, they're popular on YouTube and just seeing rare collectors just try to like beg Gary Payton just to sell this game away just because it's a rarity. When you told this story, I was just holy crap! Like, how does this copy of this game even exist?
It's amazing. And I mean, to think that after all these years, we still have this NBA Jam Holy Grail that nobody's touched. Like, nobody's seen it. Like, we're all grown up. Like, life has moved on. The Warriors went from, Run TMC Warriors to totally different Warriors today. And that NBA Jam machine still isn't out there. But yeah, it's true. So what happened was, it was right when NBA Jam came out. It was so big that even Michael Jordan wanted to be in the game, even though he wasn't actually in the game, which is to say that because of licensing issues, he kept his image out of the game. But it was either Jordan or somebody in his camp heard about NBA Jam, got really excited, asked Midway for an arcade cabinet for Michael. And the Midway guys, who are based out of Chicago, were like, of course. So they made a special version with Michael Jordan's head in the game, probably as a secret character of some kind. And then the weird thing is, yeah, like you were saying, Gary Payton got involved too, because he wasn't actually in NBA Jam. Everybody thinks he was, but he never actually was. He was in NBA Jam Tournament Edition, but not in that first game. So he really wanted to be in that first game, so he got added too because he knew Michael, and there was a whole thing. And then the third one was Ken Griffey Jr., which was just like, wow, okay, we got Michael Jordan, totally makes sense. Gary Payton, okay. Ken Griffey Jr., that just seems like just, pick a name out of a hat. Like, why not Bo Jackson, Why not Arsenio Hall? You could pick anybody from the 90s. But yeah, Ken Griffey Jr. was a big NBA Jam fan too. And he had his headshots taken from all the different angles to be put in the game. And then when the Midway team got back those headshots, they actually said, these aren't very good. Can you do them again? So he went and he did them again. So that was how much he wanted to be in NBA Jam. He had his headshots taken twice. But yeah, that machine's still out there. And as far as I know, there's only a couple places I know for sure. And one of them is Gary Payton's house in California.
So I'm dying to know when you unlock Ken Griffey Jr., and I don't know if you know this or not, is he a Seattle Supersonic or is he just like an unlockable player that's just in the game?
Good question.
Yeah, that is a good question. Honestly, I don't know myself because I've never seen that fabled version. Like, I've seen pictures of Ken Griffey Jr. with his, him actually getting his photos taken for the game itself, but not within the game. But I'm guessing he's probably some kind of unlockable character, so that way you can just put him on any team you want, which is what you would do with all the other unlockable characters at the time. But that's a really good question. I would love to know the answer. Like, so if Ken Griffey Jr. is out there listening, he should probably deliver with that answer right now.
For sure. Get at us on Twitter.
Come on, Ken. Yeah.
That's I mean, going through this just reminds me that, one of the cool things about this, I don't need to tell you obviously, but for the listeners, really pick up a copy of this book, because I think another reason this game is so great is there's just that lore behind it and that mystery. You never know what you're going to see as an unlockable character. There's all these little secrets. There's all, given the time that you couldn't just Google it and figure out what the Easter eggs were in the game. People were spending lots of money to try and find out all these secrets. The portion of the book where you talk about the tank mode in the game, where you're playing in like army style tanks, to unlock boosting of stats and everything. Just fascinating. And I'm sure that outside of maybe even what you're able to write about in the book, there's just got to be so many great rumors about the game and theories that fans of the game had. Were there any crazy theories that people had that you weren't able to get into the book? Were there any other theories out there that you had heard of?
So there's a couple of things that come to mind, not necessarily theories, but more like bad tips I got. Like, somebody said, chase down this lead or look this up, and it wasn't actually anything. So one of them was that Mark Trammell, the main creator of NBA Jam, so essentially the creator of NBA Jam, the lead programmer, there was a rumor that somebody told me that at one time in the early 90s, he had a giant NBA Jam logo at the bottom of his swimming pool. And I was like, wow, what an amazing visual. I hope that's true. I want to put that in the book. That'd be great. And
Please let
then
that be
I asked
true.
somebody else. Yeah, turns out I don't even think he had a pool. So not true, but it was a really cool idea. And then actually, I'm pretty sure it was the same source that told me this one as well. I should probably double check their quotes now that I'm talking about him. But he's a good dude. He also told me that he heard that. So the Beastie Boys, they appeared as secret characters in, I think it was NBA Jam Tournament Edition, one of the home games. But back then it was a Wild West in terms of licensing. Like what they would do is they'd take people and just put them in the game without actually paying them for it or clearing it with them in the first place. So that's how Will Smith got in the game, and George Clinton and DJ Jazzy Jeff. None of these guys got paid. There was no authorization. But yeah, they were thinking of other people, like the Beastie Boys, who did end up making it into the game. And the Beastie Boys sued Acclaim. This is the rumor. They sued Acclaim because they were in the game. Yeah, and they hadn't given their likenesses up. I believe that's false from what I've investigated, and I couldn't find anything to corroborate it. But it was a pretty cool idea. And then the last one is some secret characters that were in very early versions or they're thinking about that never actually came to fruition. One of them was Ted Nugent. So Ted Nugent was a secret character once upon a time, very briefly. And the other one was Flea from Red Hot Chili Peppers.
Oh, nice.
Oh, wow.
That would have been really cool. I mean, that would have been awesome.
Yeah.
And I feel like people would still be talking about Flea in NBA Jam if that had come to fruition. But there's like one article out there somewhere that references Flea being in NBA Jam. But besides that, nothing really came of it. But it was so cool to like at least see that little artifact that, wow, this was once upon a time almost a thing.
That's so cool. I mean, there's just so much history, so many tidbits with this game. It's incredible. So another thing I wanted to ask about was selfishly first off, I want to know, what is your favorite iteration of all these NBA jams that are out there? Do you have a favorite version or a slight variation of these games? Because we know there's like NBA Showtime and others that went by different names. What's your personal favorite to go back to? Are you just down for the classic or tournament edition, or is there a newer one that's kind of perfected in your mind?
Oh, that's a good question. So from a historical perspective, I really love Tournament Edition because it's got all the good stuff from NBA Jam, but it's even better and it's got more stuff in there. And I really love like the look and the vibe of Tournament Edition, where it's like NBA Jam 1, but a little bit better. But from a play perspective, I really love NBA Hang Time, the one that they released just after NBA Jam Tournament Edition, and I think it was
yes. I'm so glad you said that.
Oh, I love me some Hang Time. So good. And Matthew Perry's a secret character, Chandler from Friends, which is just like,
really?
Yeah, how did he get in there? Yeah. And he reached out to Midway for that. Yeah. No, it was like, what? I had no idea about this either when I was like researching the book. I was like, Matthew Perry, that sounds like a, one of these hoaxes you read about. Like another one of these fake codes, like, oh, Al Pacino's in NBA Jam and so is Santa Claus and Charles Manson. But I'm like, I don't know about them. But yeah, it's so cool. So
Matt Perry was in Tournament Edition, or he was in Hang Time?
He's in Hang Time. Yeah. Yeah.
Awesome.
Hop on YouTube, look up Matthew Perry NBA Hang Time, and from what I understand, that he also, like Ken Griffey Jr., sent in his headshots to Midway. So he was a huge fan of NBA Jam right when his career was, I would say, at its peak.
Nice. It's about time Chandler gets a little redemption.
Absolutely. I wish they had like all the Friends people in there. That would have like added another level. Like, you can mix and match them. You could do Phoebe and Chandler in one versus, Rachel and Ross. Oh my gosh, get Gunther in there. You could do so much.
That is my girlfriend's favorite show. She'd be the biggest fan of that game if that
That's
was
awesome.
the truth. She'd play it 24/7.
You definitely got to pull up the YouTube video to be like, check this out, and be like,
right,
and have her be like, why is Matthew Perry in this basketball game from 1996? And then be like, he wanted to be in it. Yeah. So the history just keeps going and going, and that's just so fun. I mean, I wrote this book. I spent all these years talking about it, and I legitimately still am learning new things all the time.
So since you bring up Hang Time, and selfishly, that is my favorite version of this game as well. I mean, that's the one I easily logged the most hours on. Can you go into the development of that game a little bit? And I know you had mentioned in the book that it didn't get marketed as well necessarily. There's kind of a generic basketball player on the cover, not an actual NBA player. Can you go into the history on that game a little bit, just selfishly for myself?
No, by all means, yeah. So NBA Hang Time was Midway's first basketball game after NBA Jam Tournament Edition. So this really interesting division happened in 1995 where Midway and Acclaim, so Midway putting out the arcade games and Acclaim putting out the home games, decided to go their own separate ways. And then Acclaim went on to make NBA Jam Extreme, this really awful early 3D NBA Jam. Juwan Howard did motion capture for the game. I'm not sure if I mentioned that in the book, but like, yeah, I also learned about Juwan Howard doing motion capture for it. I was like, okay, this is a thing too. But yeah, so Acclaim over there had this awful game, NBA Jam Extreme. Meanwhile, Midway really kept, they kept the basics. Like they could have gone in the 3D direction, but still kept it kind of 2D with NBA Hang Time. So yeah, that time they weren't really paying too much attention to what Acclaim was doing. They knew that Acclaim had the NBA Jam license, but they really wanted to focus on what they were up to. By that point, they were really riding high off of NBA Jam. It was such a big hit. I think that they were probably a little disappointed by the fact that Hang Time wasn't NBA Jam levels of huge. But, there's no way you can reach NBA Jam. NBA Jam is one of those that just comes by once in a lifetime, Like, they won't make NBA Jam. Like, if you release NBA Jam tomorrow, you put all the marketing money in the world, nothing is going to replicate that. Nothing. You can't buy that kind of hype. Yeah. But, yeah, Hang Time. What else do I know about Hang Time off the top of my head? I would say that with Hang Time, they definitely were thinking about how they can refine the game. So, NBA Jam was the basic ideas that they were putting down. Hang Time was where they get into the alley-oops, where they're really trying to say, okay, what can we do to try to make this 2-on-2 thing more interesting? So, yeah, when I think about Hang Time, I always think about those great graphics. I mean, that was when they introduced the Canadian teams, and I was so excited about that. I was like, oh, yeah, we got the Raptors and the Grizzlies in here now. Let's go.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's such a fun game. What else about Hang Time? It was just an interesting time for the company. Yeah.
Yeah, and correct me if I'm wrong, but I think that was the first time you could create your own player, right?
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, that was when they introduced it. Yeah. And they were thinking about introducing it in NBA Jam, but that wasn't feasible. There was a whole bunch of ideas they had on the table for the actual original NBA Jam that never materialized. Like once upon a time, they were thinking about making NBA Jam 1-on-1, which would have been weird. Wouldn't have been the same at all. Glad they didn't do that. But, they had like a coaches mode. I don't exactly know what that was going to all entail, but there was some kind of coaches mode involved. They had these cutaway angles for dunks. They had all these different ideas. And of course, through the process, it all gets whittled down. But yeah, that creative player, that was such a cool feature. You can make that cool little alien. I always like the alien.
Yeah. I was the Wolf Man for a good.
Oh, that's awesome.
My creative player, or Teen Wolf maybe.
Oh, that's Teen Wolf. Oh my gosh, that would have been a killer secret character.
Oh my goodness.
Wow. Now I'm disappointed that's not an NBA Jam. See, like
potential there.
Man, so much potential.
Yeah, it feels good as a reader when you get to that portion in the book and you hear about NBA Hang Time and Acclaim's NBA Jam Extreme. I mean, I don't want to spoil things too much, but for me as the reader anyway, and as someone who enjoyed a lot of these games, I mean, especially NBA Jam and Tournament and Hang Time, it felt good to me to see Midway kind of come through with that and continue with their success. I mean, of course, it gets to be a roller coaster and all that element too. I mean, even outside of NBA Jam itself, it's really interesting to hear the constant stress and pressure that these game developers are under. And we know that game developers still to this day seem to be that way, even though their teams are much bigger than they are as the, I think you said it was a 7-person team on NBA Jam, right?
Yeah, it was just 7
so
people.
Improbable.
Yeah. No, and that's one of those things. That's another one of those things that really represents just how of a different time NBA Jam was. The idea that you could have this huge, this marquee game that gets ported to every console under the sun, that makes $1 billion, that has this big license, literally just 7 people putting it together. I mean, aside from the hardware people and the executives and things like that, the testers, just 7 people. So it was such a different time. But yeah, they were worked really hard. They were definitely run ragged through the making of NBA Jam and a lot of those classic games. And, as a fan, that was one of those things that was a little hard to read or learn about, because you've got that thing where you put that thing that you love in this kind of, you put in like this amber in your head where it's like, oh, it's so perfect. Like, I love it so much. It represents all these positive, amazing memories for me. And then you also learn that somebody had to basically just, live in the office to get it finished. That was eye-opening, but that's the reality of the game business.
Yeah, for sure.
Well, thank you very much for joining us. Did you want to go ahead and push any other projects you're working on? Just push where we can find the book, where listeners can go check it out.
Yeah, just Google NBA Jam the book. You can find it on Amazon. You can find it on bossfightbooks.com, on the publisher's website. I'm also on Twitter and Instagram at NBA Jam Book. Always posting lots of old video game goodness. So especially if you love like 90s arcade stuff, yes. If you're into 90s video games, 90s arcade, 90s Capcom, 90s Midway, and some 90s NBA, definitely the spot to hang out. But yeah, as far as other things that I've got going on, I was just talking to somebody else about this. They were asking me about, what I would want to do next, or another video game book. And I would really love to do a Mortal Kombat book someday. Nice. I would just kill to do that. I mean, I've already got all the contacts. I know the history off the top of my head. There's so much that would go into that. Now, keep in mind, that isn't actually happening next. That's just my dream project. But I am working on a second book that's going to be totally different from NBA Jam. Probably won't come out for a while. It's still very early. But yeah, it was super awesome to finally get this out after 4 years. So I'm like, all right, just really try to think hard. What's the next move going to be? So it's kind of, I'm half enjoying it and half thinking ahead. So still a lot more to come.
So I can't imagine anyone better to write that book. I mean, with all the digging that you've already done through Midway and their staff and everything, I'll look forward to that someday.
I appreciate that. Hopefully in this lifetime, you'll see a Mortal Kombat book out there. I've even got the title worked out. I've got an outline there and everything. It's mostly in my head, but I've got it out there.
Nice.
Awesome. Thank you very much for joining the show. Stay safe, and we look forward, if that Mortal Kombat book ever comes out, we'll be the first in line, definitely. Looking forward to reading that next.
I love it. Thank you guys so much for the support and for having me on and for the great questions. I appreciate it.
Yeah, thanks, Ray. Good to talk to you.
All right. Pleasure talking to you guys.